All right. Hello, everyone. For those who don't know me, I am Chelsea Martins. I'm the Marshall County Master Gardener Coordinator. And I have other roles as well. I work with youth, and I also work for agriculture programming as well. So thank you guys for hopping on. If this is your first, second, or third session with us, thank you for joining. Today we're going to learn all about trees. So I am going to let Mark go ahead and take over for now. Know that you guys can ask questions in the chat box at any time. I will monitor the chat. Feel free to also unmute yourself and ask questions, or we will have a question and answer at the end as well. So write anything down that you might want to just ask at the end. All right, Mark, it's all yours.
Okay. Let me minimize. Whoa, that's interesting. Tried to minimize the Zoom and it didn't minimize. Okay, so can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Good.
Good to go.
So the talk is selecting and planting trees near landscape, and these are going to be mostly native Iowa trees. And it is important, very important, to plant native plants because insects, pollinators, birds, they know the resources in those plants and they can utilize those. Non-native plants, that just may be, that could be a building rather than, they don't consider it something that they can utilize. So try to stick with natives when you can. So I'll introduce myself a little bit now. I have been a Jasper County Master Gardener for 7 years. I do have a connection to Marshall County though, because I teach at Marshalltown Community College. I'm a combination mathematician, engineer, computer scientist who now teaches math at Marshalltown. So moving right along. Today's topics. Don't just walk into a nursery and go, oh, I'll just buy one of those trees. Anyone will do, because there's a lot of differences between them and you need to look at those. And then I'll talk a little bit about planting trees and some trees that you might want to look past, might want to ignore. And the trees I list in there are going to range everything from absolutely do not buy this tree to, well, you better make sure you know what you're doing if you buy this tree. And then we'll look at a bunch of trees that hopefully you'll see some that you want. So, considerations when buying a tree. Size, mature size of the tree is very important. And actually thinking about the size of the tree as it grows. How close should it be to your house? How close should it be to electrical wires or the sidewalk or your driveway? Those are important considerations. Also, the soil. Some like it dry, most like it medium, some like it wet. And the same thing with acidic versus neutral versus alkaline soil. There's all kinds of different preferences. And it's not hard to test your soil to find out if it's alkaline or acidic or other things, phosphorus level, nitrogen levels, so forth. So those are good things to check out before you plant a tree. Shade tolerance. Just because you're looking at a small tree doesn't mean that it likes growing in the understory in the shade of other trees. So check that out. And then growth speed. Of course, people tend to want the tree to grow quickly and mature quickly because they want a nice big tree. But in general, slow growth means sturdy, and fast growth often means brittle wood that can crack apart and break and drop limbs. Sometimes that's not a big deal. Maybe it's a small tree and the limbs aren't that big, or maybe it's a huge tree and it could wreck your house. So big consideration there. Maintain a variety. We live in an older neighborhood. I live in a 100-year-old house, and we've got a lot of mature oaks and hickories and other things, but a ton of oaks. And unfortunately, oak wilt is in the area and it'll kill oak trees. Red oaks, well, I lost one that used to sit right there. The tree next to it lost a large limb, took some limbs off of the oak in the middle of the summer, and by the end of the summer, it was dead. So yeah, but that's a red oak. A white oak might take a couple years to kill, but it'll still kill it. So know the pros and cons of your tree. Is it a weak wood tree? Is it messy? Does it have problems like oak wilt? Although I don't want to totally diss oaks. I'm going to talk about 5 of them. And then is the tree you're actually looking at the nursery a good specimen? Sometimes if it's the last tree there, that's because it's got some problems. You might want to not buy that last one. So here is an excellent ISU extension guide on planting and care of trees. And I've got a link there, and actually I can put into the chat later. I've got my whole presentation on a shared drive, and I can give you the link to it so you can download it. That'll work much better than emailing it around, because I think last I looked with all the pictures in it, it's about 49 megabytes. So it's a big file to email.
Yes,
So
I
anyhow,
actually, hold on a second.
Mhm.
I do have a shared Google Drive set up for this program that I also have last presentation stuff on. So give me anything you have, Mark, and then we will share that with you guys after everything's up on YouTube. I'll send you the YouTube link, then all the information that you guys heard from this presentation.
Excellent. Thank you. All right, so I'm going to show you a few snippets of this guide, but it is a free download, so feel free to download it and read it, because a tree is an investment. You know, sometimes you spend several $100s on a tree, and you don't want it to then be something that you take out a couple years later. So here's a few shots from it. This page is about size. So even though somebody bought an ornamental tree that they knew wasn't going to get huge, they planted it under the wires, and it did get too big for being under the wires. Also, it's possibly just barely tall enough that those branches are high enough that people can walk down that sidewalk underneath it there. So that's questionable. I'm looking in the background over here. There's an evergreen in front of this 2-story house. It looks like it's far enough away. Recognize, though, that it's maybe only half or a third of its mature height, so it's probably going to get twice that wide. That may still be far enough away, but think, especially with a conifer, an evergreen, think about how broad that base is going to be, and is it going to interfere with a sidewalk or a driveway or your house? On the right, you see the problems with planting a tree that's going to get quite large, too close to a sidewalk or other things. It can make a real mess of things. And then here we see a disaster in the making, V-shaped branching. And this looks like it's actually the trunk of the tree, possibly, that is, it decided to branch off. And a V-shaped branching like this is terrible. It is a crack waiting to happen. Wind or ice or snow, and that can just split one side right off or crack it right down the tree. I actually had a green ash in my old house across town, and I actually live in Newton. I used to work for Maytag before Marshalltown Community College. And one morning I was eating breakfast, and I noticed that this mature green ash, I could see through the middle of it. It had split overnight and was just kind of hanging there, forming a lovely V shape. Gave me quite a start. Luckily, we were able to bolt it back together, and it lived until Emerald Ash Borer got it. So moving right along, planting. I've got 3 different scenarios here for planting situations. So on the left, we've got planting a tree in well-drained soil. So not a heavy clay soil that tends to hold water, but well-drained soil. And this is for either a balled and burlapped tree or a container-grown tree. And by the way, burlap, take it off before you plant the tree. I know it will decompose eventually, but before it does, it will hinder the growth of the tree. So please take it off. just like you need to take the tree out of the plastic container and put it in the hole. So you need to dig a hole 2 to 3 times wider than that root ball on the tree. And I know people think, oh my gosh, that's a big hole to dig. Yes, it is, but the first thing the tree needs to do is establish its roots. And if you've just barely dug a big enough hole to squeeze it into, and it's got a bunch of compacted soil there around it, it may not grow its roots out well. They might just start growing around in the hole. And encircling roots are a terrible thing. They can actually choke off the tree and kill it. So dig a big enough hole, dig it the same depth as that root ball, because once you put it in there and fill soil back in, you want that soil filled in to the top of the root ball or the top of the dirt in the container. Do not pile additional dirt on top of there. That tree has been planted to the correct depth. You should see the trunk beginning to flare as it gets ready to go out into the roots. That should be above ground. And you should be seeing that in the tree as it sits there in the container or sticking out of the ball. And so you fill that dirt back into that same level and don't bury it too deep. The problems with burying it too deep are many, including that the surface roots are too deep, and so they actually breathe, they actually respire. And then also, that bark that's above ground is intended to be above ground. And if it is covered with soil and kept wet, it will deteriorate, and you'll actually, sometimes you'll see a mature tree or a tree that's 10 or 15 years old, and in a windstorm, it'll just snap off right at the base, just break. Probably was planted too deeply. So there's well-drained soil. In poorly drained soil, dig the hole maybe only half the depth of that root ball and make sure it's 3 times the width of it, because now you're going to mound the dirt up in there, getting it to that same height. Don't bury the root ball, just get it right to the top of the root ball. But this way, at least some of the water that lands in there from rain or from you watering it can drain away from the tree, and it's not just totally sitting in a swimming pool full of water. Then on the right, we've got planting a bare root tree. If it's a tree with many roots, as opposed to one single tap root, you're going to want to spread those out. And the easiest way to do that is actually to mound some dirt back in that hole, so that when you flare the roots out and set the tree on there, it's at the right level, so you're not going to plant it too deeply or too shallow. And then you can fill it back in, and those roots are primed for spreading out and supporting that tree. Now, if on the other hand, you've bought a mail order shagbark hickory, the shagbark hickory, you'll see a picture later that I've put in here of its taproot, and it's got a mighty long one. And so it's just going to have a single root when it arrives. And of course, you don't want that going off to one side or the other. You want it going straight down, but that hopefully will be obvious to you. So there's planting considerations. And a few more right here. The picture on the left, we've got a plant, doesn't look like a tree, that's been pulled out of a container. And oftentimes they've got overgrown roots in that container, and you need to loosen those up. I much prefer to get in there with my fingers and start pulling those roots out, fluffing it out, so that they can be laid out in the hole that you dig. To me, cutting them like this is the fast and sloppy way to do it. Because you're severing more roots than you really need to. I mean, yes, I break roots when I'm fluffing it out, but not this many, not indiscriminately. So anyhow, you don't want to just put it in the hole. Early on, I did that way before I was a master gardener. I did that with a bush, and 2 years later, it was doing horribly, and I went to take it out. I was able to just grab it and pull it out of the ground, and it still just had a ball of roots there. It looked pretty much like it did when I put it in the ground 2 years before. So you don't want that. On the right, we have a tree that's been planted nicely. Hopefully they dug the hole about the size of that mulched area there and then filled it back in, and then do not put the grass back, because that young tree doesn't need to compete with the grass for resources. Plus, if you've got grass right up around that tree, that means you have to mow and trim grass right up around that tree. And it's one thing if this is a mature oak tree with bark an inch thick, it can take the occasional scrape and the weed eater whacking it. But a young tree like this with paper thin bark, you can actually kill this tree with a weed eater. You may not sever the bark, but you may bruise the tissue under it so badly that it ends up succumbing to its wounds. So mulch around it. Please don't put the grass back. And don't do what we call volcano mulching. Some people like to mulch right up the trunk, thinking that they're helping to support the tree. Now you're keeping that trunk wet. That's just like burying it. Please don't do that. If anything, when that several inches of mulch get close to the trunk, actually dip them back down so you can actually get right to the bare dirt right at the trunk. Okay, moving along from there. The last page that I'm showing you, and this is 1/10 of this guide that I'm showing you, is about fertilizing and pruning. Don't fertilize it immediately. It doesn't help, because what happens if you fertilize it is that root system says, oh, I've got all the resources I need right here. I don't need to spread out. And then it doesn't do what it needs to do, which is get those roots spreading out into the soil to support that tree and to get nutrients. You don't need it to blow over in the wind because the roots haven't spread out. So don't fertilize it right away. And when you do fertilize it, don't dump it right around the trunk. Dump it out at the drip line, at the edge of the branches, so that the roots are reaching out for that fertilizer. But that's like next year. And then pruning. Pruning should be limited to cutting off problem branches. Don't thin the tree. There's this idea that because the roots have been compromised, that we should trim back the branches. Don't do that. There's no good logic behind that. Cut off broken branches. If you've got branches that are actually rubbing against each other, you need to take one of those off because they'll wound each other. Remove sprouts that it's talking about down here, basal sprouts, or sprouts coming out of the roots. A lot of fruit trees, crab apples love to do that. I've got a crab apple out front. I have to trim it multiple times a year, the sprouts. And then encourage a central leader. That's if it's a tree with a central trunk, and it does split somewhere up there, you're going to want to take one of those off. And hopefully you haven't picked a specimen that means you're having to cut off half the tree. I don't recommend buying that tree. And then down here in red, I've circled, don't put pruning paint or sealers on there. That doesn't help. Especially a small cut, when done properly, and this guide will tell you about how to trim a tree, it'll heal right back over that. And that pruning sealer acts more like a poison. It won't seal proper. It won't heal properly over it. So don't do that. Those shouldn't be sold. Okay, that's the end of what I'm showing you of that guide. There's another one. I've got a print copy of this one. It's also a free download. This one's from the Department of Transportation, and it simply shows each spread shows a different tree and talks about it. So that's a nice guide to just learn about native Iowa trees. I don't recommend the one that I'm actually showing here, which is probably the first one in the book, because it's an ash tree. I'll talk about why you don't want ash trees. Here's a bunch of websites. The very first one, Iowa State Extension, excellent resource, but there's others, arborday.org. Sometimes you're just wanting more pictures. Maybe Iowa State didn't have a picture that told you exactly what you wanted about it. Maybe Arbor Day does. Morton Arboretum, west of Chicago, about 25 miles, is a huge arboretum with an excellent website. doesn't have great pictures, but it has a huge amount of information about the tree. I'll actually show you one page. And then there's a couple of, well, there's Missouri Botanical Garden, a couple wildflower sites that also include trees, and others. Bunch of PDFs on government sites. That Iowa DNR link is actually a 4-page PDF that lists native trees. And it says right on it that it's taken from, it may actually be an Iowa State, well, I don't think it's an Iowa State publication, but it's taken from Iowa State information. Shows trees and some about them, just one line per tree. And over on the right, it tells you whether you're going to be able to find it or not. A lot of the trees on that guide, unfortunately, are limited availability. But if you're really interested in native trees, there's a whole bunch of them on there. Okay, now some trees to avoid. The first one is one you definitely want to avoid. It's any kind of ash, other than a mountain ash, because a mountain ash isn't a real ash. Black, green, white, blue, emerald ash borer eats all of them, and it is 100% lethal. And in order to stop it from killing your tree, you're going to have to treat that tree every other year, or some treatments every year for the rest of its life. And that costs money, and it also makes the tree poisonous. It makes it poisonous to all living creatures. So if you do it at the wrong time, you could kill all the butterflies and bees that might be coming to the tree, because yes, even trees that have inconspicuous flowers that we don't notice, the insects know about them, the pollinators know about them. So please don't buy an ash tree. If you do have a mature one that you're trying to keep alive, just make sure that you do the treatments properly at the right time so you're not poisoning other insects too much. Moving right along, here's a tree that is not an absolute don't buy it. It's just make sure you know what you're doing if you're going to buy it. Aspen, both big tooth and quaking, are native to Iowa, but they much prefer cool summers, which is why you see them up in the mountains a lot. And so they don't really do well in Iowa for the most part, although there is this one cultivar, and I got that information from the Morton Arboretum, that is tolerant of our summers. So if you're interested in an aspen, there's a possibility, but you got to recognize that they spread via their root system and suckers coming up. An aspen grove is all one organism, and they can be huge. Some of the largest living organisms on the planet are aspen groves. So if you're not wanting it to spread all over your yard, or you're not wanting to have to manage that, you might not want an aspen. All right. Cottonwood trees. They grow really fast. They get enormous, like the one that this man is standing in front of. They have weak wood and branching structures that mean that they could drop an immense limb on your house or car. They also are a type of poplar, and poplars in general, their roots like to invade sewer pipes and foundations, and that can be a pain. And then, of course, they spread via seeds that have the cotton. That's why they're called cottonwood. And they're generally considered the most hated tree in America, because all your neighbors will hate you if you have one. So moving right along, silver maples, also very large, very fast growing, very long limbs. They like to branch out very low, like the specimen I show here, and then have these huge long limbs. And if one of those breaks off, it can do a lot of damage. They're a fast growing tree, so like the cottonwood, it's brittle wood, it can break. They also happen to have roots that like to invade sewer systems as well, even though they're not a poplar. They're an acer, they're a maple. And then they do pop up suckers, and they're also quite prolific at spreading via their helicopter seeds. I'm pulling hundreds of them from my yard this last season, even though my neighbors cut down their immense silver maple several years ago. So they can be a pain too. Norway maple. Now, this is the first non-native tree that I'm showing you, and I'm only showing it to you because nurseries like to carry them. And yes, they come in these attractive colors. This is a cultivar that's purplish, reddish, burgundy, whatever you want to call that color, all season long. The problem is they're an invasive plant, and out on the East Coast, they are, I don't know if they're illegal, but nobody sells them out there. And they are on their list of species to try to eliminate. They try to get them out of forests because they will grow anywhere. They produce very dense shade, and therefore all the things that typically grow on the forest floor vanish. So they're not recommended. So I just, please don't buy one of them, even though they have this cool color. And then here's another one that's not native. It's a autumn blaze maple, which is a hybrid between a red maple and a silver. And reds and silvers are native to Iowa, but this particular hybrid, which nurseries love to carry because it's got a great name and it turns bright red in the fall, but it's a terrible tree. It grows so fast, it actually sometimes develops cracks around the connection points of limbs without any wind or ice to cause it. It's just growing too fast. And it grows too many limbs, so it becomes top heavy and can topple over in the wind or the snow. It also likes to put up suckers. People find that they're having to prune off all these excess limbs. It's just a pain. So I recommend just looking right past that one at the nursery as well. Hickories. I have 5 shagbark hickories in my yard, and I love them, even though they produce lots of hickory nuts, especially in a heavy year. The nuts are walnut sized when they drop, but they shed 4 pieces of husk, so they produce a total of 5 pieces. And in a really dense year, I can't take a single step in my yard without stepping on multiple pieces of hickory nut. So it's pretty crazy. They also have this compound leaf, that is one leaf. But that's not a problem, that's just a characteristic of it. And they've got this neat shaggy bark. Problems other than the messiness of the nuts, and they, by the way, are delicious nuts if you want to take the time to crack them open. They're very, very slow growing, and this lady is holding one here. The part of that that was above ground starts at about her ear. The rest of it is the taproot. You cannot buy these in nurseries because you can't grow it in a container. By the time it's 3 inches tall, its root is too long for the container. And I've tried digging them up when they're really little and moving them, and I've yet to be able to dig one up, taproot and all. So you can mail order them, but they're really slow growing. So there's that. And then walnuts, also difficult to find in nurseries. They're messy, messier than hickories because they drop these tennis ball sized nuts that can kill you if they hit you. And then they start decomposing. The husk turns into this lovely black messy stuff. The roots and the husks produce this juglone, I'm not even sure how to pronounce it, which is a plant growth inhibitor for many other plants. For example, tomatoes hate it. And they can grow very wide root systems, well beyond the tree, the limbs. So they can be difficult to grow under. Now I've got one and I can grow some things under it, like hostas, but those aren't native plants. Okay, moving right along, let's look at some trees that you might want to buy. So the first one would be an American basswood, also known as an American linden. And I'm going to show you the Morton Arboretum page on that, if I can find it there. So the Morton Arboretum doesn't necessarily have great pictures of trees, but look at all the information. And I know it's small text, but look at all the information it has on it. So it's just got a ton of information, from mature height and width, sun exposure, temperature zones, soil preference, tolerances and intolerances, which is a very important section to read, planting considerations, when it's ornamental or not, shape of the tree, growth rate, whether it transplants well, pests. Japanese beetles love them. I'll show you what they like to do to them. And then a whole bunch of other information, including they've got a bunch of cultivars down here as well. So very useful website. Now I'll switch back. So their leaves have this interesting lopsided shape. Not all of them are quite this exaggerated, but they actually grow with this deeper lobe dipping down on one side than the other. Elms do that as well. And then they've got this interesting flower structure that has this leaflet with flowers that come off of it, and then those turn into little green berries. This is the typical information I'm going to give you on each of the trees that I'm going to be talking about. Mature height, width can vary quite a bit from one tree to another. Some are tall and thin, some are wide, and I didn't actually put that information on here, but it's out there on those websites. So this is a pretty big tree. Typical soil preferences, moist, well-drained soil. A lot of them say that. Doesn't like salt in the soil, so, ice melt. A lot of trees say that. Some are more susceptible than others. This has got a moderate growth rate, even though it's not a overly fast-growing tree. Whoops, jump ahead there. It is susceptible to ice damage. It's just the nature of its branching structure and so forth. And then here's a Japanese beetle, and here's what it does to the leaves. Here's a mature basswood in the middle of Maytag Park in Newton that every summer, by midsummer, it just looks like this fluffy brown globe because they've skeletonized all the leaves. They leave the vein structure and eat everything in between. They can survive that. They've been doing it to it for years. As long as they don't have too many other stresses like too wet, too dry, too salty, they can survive being eaten like that, and they'll leaf out again next year. So there's the basswood. And they've got that lovely oval shape to them. So here's two types of birch, the paper birch and the river birch. They both are a clump tree, so don't expect it to have one central trunk. It grows in a cluster of trunks. The paper with this lovely white bark that peels, and then the river also has quite light colored bark, except when it starts getting big down on the base, it gets this kind of fluffy structure to the bark. I've got a huge one out to the west of my house that this could be the picture of that tree. It's not, but it could be. So here's more information on the paper birch. Medium to big tree, likes acidic soil, doesn't like drought conditions. So that's, if you're going to have, if we're having drought conditions and you've got a pretty young one, especially, you're going to need to water it. If you've got a mature one, it's going to stress it a lot if we're going through drought. Doesn't like pollution either. It's a fast growing tree. Avoid pruning birch in the spring when the sap is really flowing because they're bleeders. My river birch, I had a branch break in the wind, and it was actually later in the season, but still the sap was flowing enough. It was just trickling. There was this stream of sap trickling into my yard for a while. So river birch, they are also medium to big trees, and of course they like wetter soil. They like riverbanks. Don't like alkaline soil or drought conditions. Also fast growing, messy. They've got these flowers that'll cover things, although I put up with that pretty well. It's the sticks that they like to drop. It's like they're done with them, that there's no leaves on them anymore. They just drop these little sticks all over the place, to, 3 foot, sometimes even 6 foot long branches. Every time I mow, I have to go pick them up. So they're messy trees. Every tree I own is a messy tree. Yeah. Anyhow, and they're all mature. They were all here when I came. So here's a much smaller tree, an Ohio buckeye. It has this interesting compound leaf like the hickory, but this compound leaf, all 5 leaflets come from one point. They have these nice blossom clusters, which then turn into the buckeyes. So looking at the details on them, it's a much smaller tree, 20 to 40 feet, like acidic, moist, well-drained soil. And yeah, they're messy because they're going to drop those buckeyes. Okay, so that's a consideration. Do you want to deal with that? Other than that, they're a nice ornamental tree. And a chokecherry, it's a smaller ornamental tree, lovely blossom clusters in the spring, and then the chokecherries, they are edible. They are sour. Animals will eat them, although they're one that they'll eat later in the season. It isn't necessarily the first thing they chow down on because they are sour. So after they've gotten tired of eating or run out of everything else, they'll eat your chokecherries. So they're a 15 to 25 foot tree. They're a very different soil preference, alkaline, dry soil, and they are intolerant of dense shade. So just because they're a small tree doesn't mean they want to grow in the shade of another tree. And of course, they produce fruit, which maybe you don't like and maybe you do. The northern catalpa, I find this a fascinating tree. Unlike the basswood, which had that very symmetrical shape, this is a much more irregular shape. And then these immense leaves, they are so big that even at a distance, they give it a texture that is visible and interesting as far as I'm concerned. Then they also have these very large blossoms, which are very attractive. And then they produce these very long seed pods, which are cool when they're hanging in the tree and not so fun when they're laying on your yard. So they are messy. 40 to 60 feet, like it on the alkaline side, fast growing, which does mean weak, brittle wood. They may drop some limbs. And of course, they've got those fruit pods that are going to end up all over your yard. So you have to decide whether you're willing to put up with, raking that stuff up or not. I deal with it every year, every tree. I have oaks and hickories and walnut and river birch and a cherry tree. I've got one of these wild black cherries, although I'm not going to have it for long because it was a very mature tree. It had already lost a couple of its limbs way up there last year, and the derecho finished it off. I now have basically 2 cherry telephone poles in my yard and a white X on it saying that the city will take it out if somebody else that wants some cherry wood doesn't come and get it first. It basically looks like a palm tree now because it's got a few little branches up there. So lovely clusters of blossoms and cherries that are edible. However, mine was a mature tree. I never even noticed those blossoms or flowers because they're 60 feet up in the air. Now, if you plant a young one, they're not going to be so far up for a long time. 45 to 60 feet, acidic soil. They don't like salt spray, but mine's like 3 feet from the street, which is why the city's going to take it out for me. And it seems to have done just fine for many, many years. Fast growing. I haven't had any ice damage. It didn't start losing limbs until last year when it got old. But I do get a lot of cherries staining the street. Okay, elm trees. Dutch elm disease killed a lot of them, American and red elms being the native trees and the ones that are susceptible to Dutch elm disease. However, here are 3 American elm cultivars that are resistant to Dutch elm disease that are pictured. I'm thinking they're growing in the Morton Arboretum. They're at least pictured in the Morton Arboretum. So there are some cultivars. There's also the Chinese elm. Now it's not in any way native, and it's also very different shaped, where the American has this vase-like structure. The Chinese is a much broader spreading structure and somewhat shorter. But there's also a lot of hybrids that are Chinese American hybrids. And I'm going to show you a small snippet from this Minnesota Extension page that lists a few of the hybrids. And that page lists many, many more. It's a big page. You can see that it says, you know, this one is smaller, this one has the vase-like shape, but notice, and this isn't the only one, many of them require regular pruning during the first 15 years. That's because, notice the difference in shape between the vase-shaped American and the broad Chinese. You mix these two trees, and sometimes you get branches going in strange places, and you want to get them off of there. They may be crossing each other, causing other problems. You need to either become very educated in pruning trees and how to prune that type of a tree, or get a professional arborist. Please don't use the guys with the pickup truck and the chainsaw that are really cheap, because they're really good at butchering trees, most of them. Certainly the ones in Newton. Maybe there's some in Marshalltown that are better, but oh, the ones in Newton just butcher trees. Makes you want to cry. So anyhow, lots of hybrids that are at least partially American, partially native. The Chinese elm, why am I talking about it? It's a sturdy, good tree, even if it's not a native tree. It's a shorter tree, medium size, 40 to 50 feet. I've got all this stuff grayed out because it's like immaterial. It likes regular soil. It doesn't have any intolerance, medium growth rate, no problems. It's a great tree. My daughter has 2 of them in her yard, and they're very old. They have lost some limbs now, but anyhow, they both survived the derecho. Moving right along, here's another native one, back to the natives, a hackberry. Fascinating bark. The two-dimensional picture here does not do it justice. It looks like it's got a smooth gray bark with then these warty growths on it. And sometimes they're in little rivulets, and sometimes they're just individual ones. It depends on the tree. I just think it's the neatest bark there is. Anyhow, it's a medium size tree, fairly large for a berry tree, but a medium sized tree, alkaline soil, medium to fast growth, which does mean you can get some ice damage and wind damage from breakage, but it's a really cool tree. Then there's the cockspur hawthorn, a smaller, more ornamental flowering, and then berries, and those hideous thorns. Oh my gosh, those are dangerous, but there are thornless cultivars, thank goodness. Although those aren't totally native. So it's a 20 to 30 foot tree, ordinary soil preferences. You probably want to get one of the thornless cultivars, and you also need to pay attention to that the flowers have a mild, unpleasant fragrance. So think about where you might be putting it. If it's right by your patio where you like to sit a lot early in the season, that might not smell very good. Moving right along, the thornless honey locust. So honey locusts also have thorns, but there are thornless varieties. Matter of fact, that scientific name that I'm showing you there is a thornless form. Interesting thing about honey locusts, they have this shaggy kind of look to them, and that picture of a leaf, that is one leaf. It is a multiply compound leaf. It has a stem with side stems and then leaflets off of that, but it'll lose that whole thing as one leaf. And that means that a honey locust in the winter has lost a lot of the fine branches up there, and so it is a much more open tree in the winter versus when I sit here and look out of my family room window when it's not dark out and look at a shagbark hickory over there. It's still got all that structure up there, even though it does have a compound leaf, but it just has 5 leaflets on it. But there's much more left up there in the winter on it. So Medium to large tree, although most of them I notice around Newton anyway, are closer to that 70-foot height. It's a fast-growing tree, is susceptible to limb breakage, and you probably want to get a thornless variety. The ironwood or hop hornbeam, it's a strange name. Interesting, smaller tree, white bark when it's younger and the smaller limbs that then morphs into this very coarse bark like some other trees do. Much smaller tree, 25 to 40 feet, intolerant of poor drainage and soil salt. Not only is it slow growing, but it is slow to establish. It really wants to get its roots established before it starts putting on more limb structure. So you'll have to be patient with it, but it is a tough little tree. And then there's the Kentucky coffee tree, which is the other tree that has multiply compound leaves. That's one leaf lying there on the pavement, it looks like. And then the female trees have these seed pods. So that does make them a very messy tree if you have a female tree. Those are up to 10 inches or more long and an inch wide and then rather flat. Pretty big trees, 60 to 75 feet, slow growing. And then the females are messy and the leaves and seeds are poisonous. So you're not going to be grinding coffee with it. Thank you very much. I hope you're not going to. And then the maples. This is the only maple I'm showing you because I showed you several that I didn't want you to buy. Sugar maples are a great maple tree. They have the typical the Canadian flag maple leaf shape leaf. You may also see black maples in nurseries, but black maples are actually just a cultivar of a sugar maple. It's still a sugar maple, but they're a good tree. They're a good tree. So 60 to 75 feet, pretty good size. They are one that is very intolerant of salt. There were 3 of them planted about 10 or 15 years ago on the Marshalltown Community College campus, just west of the diagonal sidewalk and just down slope about 15 feet away from it. Unfortunately, downslope from it because all that ice melt that maintenance puts on there every winter washed down there, and they just took those trees back out of there. They were looking pathetic. They would be half leafed out and the leaves would get curly brown edges and they just looked terrible. As long as you can keep them away from the ice melt, they're a great tree. But if they're really common in your area, you got to recognize you might not want to be adding more of them, although there are not a lot of maple problems right now, but then there weren't a lot of ash problems 20 years ago or even 15 years ago. Maybe there were 15. Anyway, moving on to oaks. I got 5 different oaks here. 3 of them are white oaks, 2 of them are red oaks. So the white oaks have the rounded leaves, the red oaks, the pointed leaves. The red oaks are the ones that die really fast from oak wilt, so you really got to make sure you don't get that tree damaged or don't prune it during the growing season at all. White oaks can still die of oak wilt. It just takes them a couple years. You can get professional injections of stuff that will help prevent them from getting it so that if they do get wounded, they might not get it. And mine had been treated maybe 3 years before it lost some limbs and died. Don't know if it could have survived if it had been treated more recently. So anyhow, here's the first one, the bur oak. And I showed the picture on the upper right without leaves because the bur oak does not have a graceful form. It's got these squiggly branches, which, you know, maybe you like, hopefully you like. When I was a little tiny kid, they scared me. I thought they were like evil witch trees. Anyhow, I got 1 left in my yard. No, I got 2 left in my yard. What am I thinking? they've got these interesting leaves that at the base, they have lobes kind of like the white oak that then just turns into a big fan shape at the top. And they can vary from 6 inches to 15 inches on one tree. Um, Big tree, like alkaline on the dry side soil, so dry to moist, rather slow growing. My one out front here, I mean, yes, it was a mature tree that when I bought the house 28 years ago, I can't tell that it's changed in size at all. Of course, they drop acorns like all oaks do. In my area, they're very common, and oak wilt and bur oak blight is also in the area, and it's got it. But bur oak blight has been around for decades or centuries, and they can live with it as long as they don't have other stresses. How I can tell that mine has it late in the season, it'll just have the occasional leaf that flutters down and it's looking a little brownish around the edges. Um, but nothing like what oak wilt would do to it. So prune oak trees only in the dead of winter because you don't want the sap flowing and you don't want the bugs that feed on the sap to come in and deposit spores from other trees. That's how it's transmitted and kills them. Also, if you've got two related oak trees of the same type variety, close enough to each other that their roots are intermingled, they can also pass oak wilt from tree to tree that way. Okay, northern pin oak. I'm checking my time over here. So it's a red oak with the pointy leaves with a much rounder, more graceful form, a medium to large tree. And even though, and not a lot of, it's not a picky tree, likes well-drained soil. It does grow fast, but unlike most fast-growing trees, it's not as brittle. So it's a strong tree, still susceptible to oak wilt. And unlike regular pin oaks that hold their leaves over the winter, it tends to lose its leaves over the winter, like most trees do. Northern red oak, obviously another red oak. Big tree, 75 to 100 feet, likes acidic soil, does not like alkaline soil. So this is a picky one as far as the soil acidity. Moderate growth rate. Then I've got a couple of white oaks, the swamp white oak that has a very different looking leaf with just these bumps along the sides and a very different form. A much more pyramid shaped tree, not as round as most oaks. Also a big tree, and like you would think, swamp white oak, it likes moist to wet soil on the acidic side. And then the white oak, which is kind of its opposite of the swamp white oak because it is intolerant of poorly drained soil. It's fine with moist, well-drained soil, but not wet soil. Big tree, slow to medium growth rate. So that's the oaks. And there are other oaks native to Iowa. I just can't cover them all. I don't have that much time. So here's a much, much smaller tree, a wild plum, ornamental, edible fruit, 20 to 35 feet, like a number of fruit trees, likes dry to moist soil, doesn't like salt, moderate tolerance of alkaline soil. Like many small fruit-bearing trees, they like to put up suckers from their roots, and you do need to keep those clipped. Some of them also will grow additional sprouts out of the top of the limbs. If you're seeing sprouts that are sticking straight out of the top of the limb and they're looking very smooth and long and straight and kind of uncharacteristic of the other limbs, and that's not just on the plums, you take some of those off. I had a service berry out front here that liked to do that. Okay, and moving along to a very different tree than that, the sycamore. Huge trees, fascinating bark. In the younger or upper limbs, white bark, and then on the lower, at least when they get to be bigger trees, this kind of camouflage bark that will flake off. So they are a little messy. You'll get those chips of bark on your lawn. Plus then the leaves, there's another tree with dinner plate sized leaves, maybe not quite as big as the catalpa. And then pretty decent sized fruit that hangs off the side there. So they can be messy, but a gorgeous tree with a very broad base, very large, 70 to 100 feet, like moist to wet soil. Some of the trees, there's a bunch of them in Maytag Park, and in a drought year, I could see that some of them were quite stressed, and it says they are intolerant of drought. And those are big, mature trees, fast growing, somewhat messy. And now we move on to the conifers. I've just got 4 trees left. 2 of them are native, the eastern red cedar and the eastern white pine. The red cedar I show in the upper to the left there, and then the white pine to the right. Now the white pine is only native to the northeast corner of the state. It's not quite native to our area of the state. And then a lot of conifers actually struggle in Iowa, conifers being needle-bearing trees, because if there's not enough moisture in the soil when it freezes, and if we don't get a nice thaw in the middle of the winter and let more moisture in, or if it's too dry, they're an evergreen. They need moisture during all year long, during the winter. And so they can desiccate, they can dry out, and that really stresses them. So the red cedar does very well with it. The white pine, maybe less so. But the reason why I'm showing you these 2 deciduous conifers, they're deciduous, they lose their needles during the winter, but that's why they do well in Iowa, even though they're non-native, because they aren't dependent on water during the middle of the winter. So there's the bald cypress and the American larch, also called the tamarack. It's native to Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Illinois. There's also the European larch, which is not native to the area. So eastern red cedar, it's called red because of its wood, not because of anything you see on the surface. Medium to large tree, alkaline, dry to moist soil, intolerant of poor drainage. So you do need to be careful of placement. And remember, with any evergreen or any conifer, you're not going to want to trim this thing up unless you don't want it to look very good. And so you need to think about how wide it's going to get at the base. Is it going to be sticking out over your driveway or sidewalk or into your house? And then the white pine, which makes a lovely Christmas tree, soft needles. Some other, like the Scotch pine, have a much coarser needle. Look fluffy. They do often lose limbs as they get bigger, which gives them this less Christmas tree-ish look, but I still love what they look like. And they got kind of a medium-sized pine cone. They can get very large. I've got one a couple blocks south of me that I'm pretty sure is over 100 feet tall, and it has lost a lot of limbs, but I still love that tree. It is a cool looking tree. They like it on the acidic side, don't like salt, and they're picky about their water. That's why I said it's not a perfect tree for Iowa. They don't like drought, and they don't like it too wet. They also don't like pollution. Moderate to fast growth, and they will drip sap, so you maybe don't want it hanging over your driveway. Okay, moving on to the cypress. They turn a burnt orange in the fall, and then they look like the one on the right in the middle of the winter. That's why they're bald. And you may be thinking, don't bald cypress grow in the Everglades? Yup. They get these huge broad bases when they're growing in standing water. They still get a flared base when they're not, but not nearly as much. And so medium to large tree, acidic, wet soil, duh, since they grow in the Everglades. And of course, they lose their needles during the winter. And then the larch or tamarack turns yellow. I live close to Larchwood Court here which has a bunch of larch on it. Medium to large tree also likes wet soil, intolerant of drought conditions, fast growing tree, does have shallow roots. So they sometimes will blow over and bring up the whole root system with it. Although only one blew over in the derecho over there in Larchwood Court, and one ended up kind of getting a spiral crack and leaning on another tree, and it's got an X on it now. They're going to take it out. But most of them did just fine, didn't break off at the top or anything. Most of them did just fine in the derecho. I lost a hickory, which took out a spruce tree, and I lost the top of my cherry. Luckily, all of them fell away from the house. And here's a bunch more native trees. I don't necessarily know all that much about some of these. Some of them I know some about, so you can ask me questions now. We are to the question and answer point. I can either leave it on that page or I can go back so you can read the list of, here's just some more native trees that I pulled off of that 4-page Department of Natural Resources document of native trees. And these are all ones that it didn't say were hard to get a hold of. These were all ones that you should be able to get a hold of. So, questions?
I did have a question that I missed until we were like 2 trees past it. So Cindy asked, would having a basswood attract Japanese beetles to the area like those with yellow bag collectors? And would the beetles then go to foliage you want to protect? Or would the beetles stay mostly with the basswood? In other words, if you wanted to protect plants from the beetles, would you recommend planting basswood?
Yeah, I would not. One of the things that people will sometimes do is you can buy Japanese beetle traps that are these sacks with liquid that they'll drown in that's got the stuff in it. I don't know if it's pheromones or if it just smells like a tree they like. And they'll just go in there and they'll drown. The problem with those is they attract Japanese beetles to the area and they'll get on whatever tree or bush or whatever it is. So no. Now, if you want to talk some of your neighbors that live a couple blocks away into planting some stuff that'll attract them, maybe that'll suck the ones out of your area, but it's not gonna, unfortunately, it's not gonna keep them off of whatever else you've got. My neighbor lady has a bunch of raspberries, a raspberry plot, and she won't pick them off of it because she's tired of it. I knock them into cups of water. I knocked over 1,000 of them off one day. So they like my hydrangea and my hibiscus and kind of my crabapple. So no, planting one thing won't necessarily keep them off of another. Sorry.
And then another question, what would be your top 5 trees to plant in the country?
I guess that all depends on what you're looking for. I mean, oaks, if you don't have too many in your area, like this area was forested oak 100 years ago. When I bought the house, there were 5 mature oak trees. Oaks are great. They do fantastic in Iowa. Just don't trim them, or hopefully they don't get injured during the summer when they could get oak wilt. It really all depends on what you like. If you don't want a messy tree, I've got a river birch. I love it, but I have to pick up all those branches. My walnut I could do without, but I'm not going to take it out. I do have to go pick up the nuts off of Pat's yard because she would be complaining about it. And I have in a season picked up over 1,000 walnuts off of her half of the yard. It's growing right on the line. I love my shagbark hickories, but oh my gosh, in some of the seasons, some years they produce a ton of nuts. Um, Basswoods do very well. And they're a nice round tree. Um, and while they will sometimes get limb breakage, they don't grow huge long limbs. So if one breaks, trim the broken branch and you may not even notice it's gone. Um, I'm not usually a good one to say what's your top 10 or what's your top 5 because I just like too many of them. Um, sorry.
I did
I could think
say
about more.
I messaged her. I asked if she had something specific in mind, and she said that she has land all around a pond where they live now, and she can't do oaks because she has had oak wilt before, and she does have
Yep,
some hickories.
right. Um, Hickories aren't going to be real happy real close to the water. The river birch will certainly be happy. Um, Unfortunately, a couple of them that love water are the silver maple and the cottonwood, but you might not want to put those in. Although if the silver maple's far enough from your house and other things, it's going to be a big tree and it loves water. Um, what are other ones that like the water? I have to think about that.
Any type of a willow will like
Oh
water.
yes, of course, willows. Um, and there's a couple of them that are native to Iowa that I show here on this page. Up here at the top, the black, the sandbar, the shining. Uh, uh, Pussy willow is kind of a different little beast, but yeah. So yeah, all of those love it, and of course a weeping willow. I don't know as it's native to the state, but I do know that it likes water. So certainly willows.
Uh,
Sycamore like water too.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Someone asked, "What's your thought on ginkgo trees?"
Ginkgos, they're not native, but they are an excellent tree. Um, they are one of the perhaps the oldest type of tree still living on the planet. There are fossil records of them. I don't know how long ago. Fascinating leaf that is just this kind of fan shape. Um, Very smooth bark. They can grow quite large, but I don't know of anything that attacks them. Um, so they don't have diseases or pests that like to eat them. They do have an interesting tendency to lose all of their leaves overnight. So you may come out one day and, oh, the tree's bare. And now the lawn is covered. There are female and male, and the female do produce a fruit. Um, my neighbor to the southeast here used to have a female one that was close enough to the road that as we were walking down the street, we'd see them smashed on the road. People tell me that the ginkgo fruit is smelly only when you break it, not when it just falls or you pick it, but when you break it. Except I've walked past them smashed all over the road for years and I never smelled a thing. And I got a pretty good sniffer, so I don't know. That one didn't seem to smell. Um, Anybody familiar with smelly ginkgo fruit? But we've still got one down the street that is male, and it's a great tree. And the one that was here, unfortunately, it was really close to the power line, so it had been horribly trimmed. So it wasn't too bad that he took it out. Somebody else flashed something into the. I could actually.
Mara said, "Yes, they smell awful."
They smell awful. Yeah, that's just it. I'd been walking past it for quite a while when it suddenly struck me. Wait a minute, this stuff is supposed to smell horrible. Why am I not smelling this stuff? I don't know. Maybe that was an unsmelly ginkgo.
I think cities that have like line their streets like Ames have had lots of complaints of the smell.
Mhm.
Interesting.
So put in a male ginkgo. And you know, that can be, unless you mail order it, that may be difficult to figure out. Buy it in the fruiting season, see whether it's got any fruit on it or not. I guess I could stop my timer that's telling me how long I'm talking.
That was all the questions we had in the chat box. So does anyone else have any more questions? You can put in the chat or unmute yourself. Either way works.
Yeah, unmute yourself. And I'm amazed that I didn't think of the sycamore that likes water, because I talked about that in this talk. They don't like drought, they do like water. There's several in Maytag Park, down a valley, and man, it gets soggy down in the bottom of that valley. I like to play disc golf, and if the disc goes down there in the wrong time of year, but the sycamores love it.
Hey,
Hey,
Does anyone else have any questions? I definitely got several private chats that said this presentation's been very good, so thank you, Mark.
well, good. Thank you.
I'm watching a program on native trees.
Well, no one else has any other questions. Let's see.
I'm looking to see if
I
I know.
planted a service berry and it has tons of sprouts. Was it planted too deep or is that typical?
They will. That's one of them that'll sprout. And it's ones that birds and squirrels love those berries, and they'll eat them really early in the season. But yeah, they like to sprout, and that's one that not only will they get sprouts out of the roots, they'll get them straight up out of the branches, which is kind of weird. But it's a nice tree. I have seen monarch butterflies flocking on my serviceberry, which is really cool. I'll walk around the corner of the house not realizing it, and all of a sudden the monarchs start taking off. It's a very good native tree, and it's growing on the north side of my house, and it's doing just fine. I've got a big, tall, two-story house and lots of shade trees.
Okay, any other questions out there? All right, if not, that's all we've got for you guys tonight. Mark, did you have contact information at all?
I can certainly give you contact information. I don't
remember if you had it on a slide or you could pop it in the chat box.
I
Either
can
way.
pop it in the chat box. I'll give you my Mark Math Monroe at Gmail rather than my Iowa Valley email address. So Mark Monroe was taken. Whoops, I misspelled that. I was talking while I was typing, so that one's wrong.
I can't talk and type. I totally understand.
Yep. Mark Math Monroe, since I teach math. And I don't know if anybody noticed, but what I've got behind me is a fractal abstract tree. So that's a mathematical tree structure, mixing math and trees. Anyway.
I wonder what that was. I thought it was like a part of a beehive, kind of a little thing going on or something.
because they made it very hexagonal, the way they made the fractals work. Yes, it looks very much like a honeycomb.
Yes.
Somebody's got a lovely monarch butterfly background behind her there.
What technology does. That's pretty cool. Okay, so if no one else has any other questions, we'll go ahead and end tonight's program. I will make sure to send out a Google Drive link after Mark gets me any information that he wants to share with you guys, so you guys can get that afterwards, and know that there will be stuff from an herb presentation too. You guys can go in and out of any folder that you guys want. And I will also put Mark's email address in that chat, or in the email as well, so you guys can have that in case you didn't capture that tonight. So that's all I got for you. Thank you guys for joining. And I am going to send out afterwards within that email, just a survey just to figure out where you guys found the information about the presentation, so I know how to better get out future stuff that we host in the future. So thanks again for joining us, and I hope to connect with all of you guys again at some point in time in the future. Thanks.
Thanks for tuning in.